Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Eggs. Today's guest is Chris Wallace. Chris is the co founder and president of InnerView, a marketing consulting firm that helps companies effectively transfer their brand messages to their employees and partners. He is a successful entrepreneur in the sales and consulting and coaching space with more than 15 years' experience in sales, marketing, and corporate leadership. Beyond his work with clients, Chris is able to apply his passions as a teacher and author. He is taught as an adjunct MBA professor at Temple's Fox School of Business and has been published in outlets such as HBR, Harvard Business Review, and chief marketer, and is a contributor to publications including Inc.com and Forbes.com. So, without any further ado, please welcome our guest, Chris Wallace.
Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me, gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks for making the time for us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, so Chris, let's just kind of kick this baby off and let's get going. Start a little bit by telling our audience who you are, where you come from, and why we should care.
How much time do we have on the why you should care?
Don't worry, we're easy.
I'm originally from upstate New York. I'm born and bred in the Syracuse area. Stayed home, went to Syracuse University for undergrad, and made my way to Philadelphia through a few different paths involving a woman, as you could probably assume, involving a relationship.
Always that way, right?
That's always something with those guys.
Have been in the general Philadelphia area for the last 15 or so years, and live just outside Philadelphia with my family.
Nice.
So let's talk a little bit about the business that you run. InnerView. Explain to us a little bit about what you guys do, and then we'll dig into how it all got started.
Sure. Yeah. So InnerView is a consulting firm that some partners of mine and I founded, essentially to help consumer brands align their marketing, their external marketing strategy with their internal teams. For a long time, the partners that I've worked with, we've worked for companies that have major consumer presences, who are bringing a lot of products to market, who are trying to win favor with the consumer. And what's happening is they spend all this money to advertise and distribute their product and brand messages directly to the consumer. But the people that talk to the consumer every day, whether they're in retail stores or in call centers or their direct sales team, none of them talk about it the same way. The disconnect between the marketing side of the house and the frontline representatives, whether they're in sales or technicians or customer service, that gap was so huge. So we looked at it and we said, organizations are spending so much on marketing and advertising that even a little bit of a breakdown between what they're telling the customer and what the customer experience is in this age of customer experience focus, we looked at it and we said, man, that's got to be worth a lot of money. So that's why we founded InnerView, was really to help marketers close that gap and better align their brand with their employees who are out there talking to customers.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great spot to spend energy right now because, especially like you mentioned in this sort of super consumer-centric, experience-driven market, it makes a ton of sense. Also, I don't know if you've heard it recently. What's the guy from StoryBrand? He's basically thrown kind of a gauntlet at branding versus marketing. And so I think that this is kind of an interesting thing to be talking about because there's a lot of people, trying to drive brand and marketing apart right now versus, sort of looking at them all as one type thing.
Donald Miller.
Yeah, Donald Miller is the guy. So anyway, I wonder, how does your sort of perspective work on that? So, I mean, obviously you're trying to get brand and marketing to sort of work in concert with one another. How do you guys do that?
Well, I think it's brand and marketing, and then really the sales and the customer touch points. So the approach that we take is, some of this is founded in employee engagement and in employee experience principles as well, which is the people who sit at the front line. So think about the brands you typically interact with. The people who are out there interacting with customers every single day, they're typically some of the lowest paid employees that work for the organization. They have they have a million different initiatives being thrown at their head. They have a million different priorities, and they're expected to keep it all straight and still deliver a great experience to the customer. Well, rather than looking at those folks as an audience that we need to try to cram one more thing down their throat, we really look at them as an audience that needs to be convinced at how great their brand is or how great a product initiative is. So the way that we do that is a lot of it comes down to gathering their input, asking them for their input, and just in the same way marketers ask customers for their feedback, and they do market research to find out whether or not their product and brand messages are resonating with the customer. Well, we do the same thing, only we do it internally. We find out if those messages, we're not doing knowledge checks. We're not checking if the training worked. What we're doing is we're really checking if that message is actually getting through. If that's the story, that if the way that the marketers see it is the way that the people who are out there talking to the customers see it. And we sort of measure the gap in between those two things. So a lot of it comes down to just asking people what their opinion is and being able to measure that in some sort of a scalable way.
So are you doing like a questionnaire type thing? Or are you doing an interview with them and then just kind of like being vague about it, not telling what you're trying to get out of them? Or how do you define the gap?
It's a little bit of a blend of all of those. So it's an electronic based tool that we use. So we use, you could call it survey based. We hesitate to call it a survey because it's a little bit more structured than your typical, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? We had worked with a market research company who was gathering market research and voice of the customer data and sort of adapted that methodology. And it's a very structured approach that we take. But what we're doing is we're taking the different aspects of a brand or different aspects of a product, and we're breaking those. We're taking a product and we're breaking it out into anywhere from 10 to 14 different components. Think of it as sort of the feature benefit set. We're taking the value proposition and exploding it, basically.
Okay.
And then we're measuring the attitudes and opinions that both the corporate teams and then the frontline teams have toward those different attributes of the product or those critical elements. And then we're comparing their answers. We're looking at the statistical comparison between the way one audience is answering it versus the corporate team. So the people at the front lines, really all we're asking them for is their candid perspective on how well they think their company is doing in certain attributes. They're rating their brand on certain attributes. And the places where they're rating them the highest, well, those are the places that they have the most confidence. But they may have the most confidence in it, but is that what the corporate marketing team and the brand team wants them talking about? That's where it's almost like, to use my wife's phrase, it's like playing 3D chess. We get this data back, and then we go back to the corporate teams and say, here's a comparison between what you think and what they think.
That reminds me of an episode of Big Bang Theory where they had 3D chess set up.
Okay, well, cool. Well, I feel like now we've got a pretty decent view of what you guys do. Let's talk a little bit about how you got there. So, you are one of the co-founders of this company, right? So, but I mean, you probably didn't come right out of school doing this. Well, what does your trajectory look like?
You ended up getting an MBA from Temple, right?
I did.
And then you went from there and started working for a minor league baseball team, right? Was that kind of how you got your feet wet in this kind of like trial and error and working with?
Actually, the minor league baseball was in a previous life. That was during my undergraduate days.
Okay.
I worked in minor league baseball, and I still say to this day, most of everything I needed to know about customer experience, I learned from working in minor league baseball.
Selling peanuts, or
I did stadium customer service and operations. Let's put it this way: if a soda got spilled on somebody from one of the suites above, I was the person who had to go in and help clear up the situation, right?
Nice.
Help make the customer happy. And, somebody pays $7 for a minor league baseball ticket and they want the world and they expect you to be, and that's not to diminish it. They want a good experience for their family. And I learned early on how important it was really to understand that customer and really be focused on the right outcome for them.
So
that sort of is thread through my whole career.
Did you learn the hard way, or did you learn just kind of observing? Because I tend to learn the hard way. I'll say something I shouldn't, and then the boss comes in and tells me that.
So it's funny. It was the exact opposite. So the boss was the one that was more likely to say the wrong thing, and they stopped sending the boss and they would send me. And it's just, it comes down to, listening and letting people vent and trying to understand the perspective that they're coming from. And I have my pose that I do where I'd put my hands behind my back, I'd bow my head a little bit, and I'd listen to them. I would not, and believe me, I like to talk, but I learned to just shut up and listen to them and hear them out. And after they vented, they almost always felt better. And then I was always in a position to be able to help them. But again, that same principle, all the companies we work with, whether it's in the telecom space or the manufacturing space, really helping them institutionalize some of those practices so they are driving their brand message home and driving that customer experience. It's not any more complicated than working in a minor league baseball stadium.
Well, it's true. And, it's funny because, we always say this to our kids that, we sort of feel like everybody needs to have a little bit of time working customer service, whether that's at the ballpark or like in my case, I worked in a consumer, like in a store, not Walmart, but something like that. And, the experiences I had dealing with angry people and happy people and, what you could do to change a person's day or whatever, like those experiences that you engage in over the time that you do customer service, whether it's fast food or whatever, are, basically, like you're saying, they sort of shaped the way that I handle business today.
Well, it also, if you've worked in the Denny's as a server and have been constantly like yelled at and had bad experiences, not to be that customer. You know how it feels. There's so many people out there. I see some interactions. I'm like, how does that person even cope with life, let alone getting your meal right at Denny's?
If you can't handle pickles coming out on your cheeseburger without a meltdown,
right.
What's it mean? What happens when the car breaks down?
Well, you guys bring up a great point. Honestly, I think that think about a Denny's. Think about any of these brands. Who's the face of their brand? Who is the person that is impacting that customer's experience more than anyone else?
Well, yeah, to your point, it's not Mr. CEO. It's that frontline associate that's making $6.75 an hour and working all night.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Break down crying when the guy chews her out for no reason. I've been there. I've had to tip her $20 because I felt bad. I was like, here, that was horrible. I'm sorry I didn't stand up and defend you.
But Denny's might be a little bit of an extreme example, maybe, because you're talking about wait staff, and that's a hard gig as it is.
Yeah.
But think about, this cuts across. We do work in the banking space, and I've had conversations with our banking clients about the people that work in bank branches. The people that work in bank branches don't have Harvard MBAs typically. These are folks that that come from. And again, these are the most critical people in the organization.
They're the front line.
They are shaping the customer's opinion.
100%.
Yeah, no, that's true. So let's sort of try and get back on that track about how InnerView came to be. What made you decide to go into business for yourself?
I always say I'm an accidental entrepreneur. I went and got my MBA to climb the corporate ladder. At the time, I was working for a really phenomenal organization in Comcast, and despite what some people immediately react to when they hear the word Comcast,
I've held my tongue. I try.
It's a tremendous progressive organization. They're making huge strides and huge progress and huge investments in their customer experience, and I give them a lot of credit. They grew through acquisition so fast. But I was working with Comcast, and I was in their entertainment group, and ended up in a situation where they purchased NBC Universal, and I was going to end up having to relocate as part of that. And to their credit, they said, if you don't want to relocate, we'll try to find a landing spot for you. But that landing spot happened to be a 1099 role, a contract role, and not a full-time role. And I said, I'm going to give this a shot. And I ended up in their new businesses group. And new businesses was responsible for exactly that, creating, incubating, and launching new revenue streams for the organization. But with anything new comes change and comes heartache. And what they did was they put me, I was a one-man show, and they said, we're launching this new stuff. Your job is to get people to talk about it the right way. And you're talking about an organization that has 30,000 employees on the phone.
Was that the Xfinity rebrand?
Actually, no, this was post-Xfinity rebrand. I helped launch the Xfinity Home security and automation service and helping them really activate that product internally for their call centers and really all their customer-facing channels.
I just remember when they launched that, that's a little weird, just a whole different brand for the same thing. So I could see how I could see how someone in your role working with the employees and trying to get the same, guidelines across the board for everyone would be difficult, especially in a big corporate setting like that.
We still tell them we wish that InnerView was around when they relaunched as Xfinity, because I don't know that you could come up with a better example of how we would try to take the message that the brand is trying to communicate to the customers and pull that through the internal teams. It took a while, but that's something we would have loved to have had a crack at. But we do some rebrand type work, a lot of it with organizations when they're launching new brands, or if they're merging with somebody and they have to take two brands and mash them into one. That's a big part of what we do as well.
Yeah.
But in working with Comcast, they gave me an opportunity. And what ended up happening was they said, this is working. Our people need this, and we're seeing results from it. Built up a company and actually ended up selling that company.
Oh, nice.
Sold to a company out of Chicago and merged in with that organization. And after about 18 months, a partner of mine and I realized that was not necessarily going to be our long-term future with that organization. And we spent some hard hours thinking about what we were going to do next. And we looked over our past work and we looked at what the needs of the organizations were that we worked with. And InnerView is what rose to the top, really working with the marketing and the brand side of the house to get that consistent story, because a consistent story means a consistent experience. And the holy grail for these consumer brands is a consistent experience.
So as you were starting to develop the company and you were trying to, sort of find your way, were there any, you mentioned in your pre-interview and elsewhere that there was some sort of the bumps along the way. Can you talk a little bit about any failures or any issues that came along in the early days that you've had to work through and overcome, and what you learned from them?
Well, I can say it pretty plainly that if the first company was exactly what we wanted and the second company was exactly what we wanted, there wouldn't be a third company.
Right.
So we learned a lot along the way with both of those organizations, and we really look at it as it's really one book, but there's different chapters. And InnerView is really the latest chapter that reflects what we learned. And I think really where the bumps, I think probably the best example of the bumps, we're very passionate about what we do and the value we add to organizations. We see it day in and day out with these frontline teams and the way that they're energized by the work that we're doing, and really, kind of seeing them have passion for their company again. But what was happening was we were in conversations when we merged with the firm out of Chicago called Growth Play. Really good concept, good leadership at that organization. But we ended up in all these conversations with prospective clients, and we were saying one thing, and they were listening for something different. And it just wasn't working. And we were talking to the sales organization inside these companies. And we were sort of telling a marketing story, or we didn't know it at the time, but we were talking marketing speak. They were speaking sales, and it wasn't really meshing.
What was the holdup? What were they trying to, what were they thinking, and what were you telling, and what were they not understanding?
That's a great question. Really what it came down to was their expectation of what they needed was, we felt like more of a short-term remedy. The phrase I always use is, those folks were looking to buy headache medicine. They were looking to buy ibuprofen or acetaminophen. They weren't necessarily looking. They were looking to solve a problem that happened yesterday. Whereas we felt as though what we were talking about was, no, your brand is about more than just yesterday, and you've got to make investments on the front end. And it was always about really how can we get that short-term solution? They wanted to buy training. They wanted people to come in and my team's not closing. Yeah. They wanted sales trainers. And we always tried to brand ourselves as, we're not sales training. We really are all about making a connection with your employees. And it's not training per se, but their concept, the old school sales mentality concept of how to improve is, we need a sales trainer to teach my people how to close or teach them how to ask the right probing questions. But in an age where brand is especially with the industries we work in, they're consumer industries, brand is so key. And sales wasn't thinking about brand. They were thinking about, how can I get results? Well, we can get them the results, and we knew we could get them the results. They just didn't want to hear our way, because their concept of what they needed was, we were losing deals to companies like Richardson and other like larger sales training companies. And we're like, we don't even belong in the same arena with them. Like, that's not, we're playing on the wrong field. And the biggest aha for us was, we've been telling the right story. We've just been telling it to the wrong people. And we've seen such a difference, even in just the couple of years since we started InnerView. The difference in the reception to our story is tremendous.
So who'd you go to, like the HR, and say, hey, or not even HR would be like, you'd have to get on the management level and kind of convince them, and then have it trickle down from there, because I'm sure they're the ones who are going to make a decision like that.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting insight. Maybe you can elaborate on it a little bit more, is that idea of speaking to the right person. As you mentioned, it wasn't your message, it was rather who you were speaking to. And so I wondered about, sort of what, I guess, what bit of awareness or what drew you to that idea that you were speaking to the wrong person, and how did you know to pivot and who to speak to afterwards?
Yeah, So the benefit of time after leaving the organization that we merged with, the time to stop and think and really look at what audiences did we have the most success with, who really seemed to care about our story, what were the projects that we did over the years where we had the most success. We spent intensive time to look at it, and really what it was we better defined the problem. And rather than defining the problem as sales not performing, the problem became defined as marketers having a hard time getting their story downstream. So in taking the time to really think through and look at the evidence that we had from our experience, all signs led back to we're support for marketing. Marketing is bringing all these things to market at a rapid pace. And we've done research around this. We've looked at other people's research around this. Products and services are being brought to market, especially by big companies, so fast that their people at the front lines don't have time to adjust. It's not that people don't know how to close or they don't know how to engage a customer. It's that they're having a hard time absorbing these new things in the context of their brand and in context of the experience. And it wasn't sales fault or sales problem. It really was a marketing problem. And we found marketers more than willing to say, yeah, we've got a real challenge with getting our story downstream and keeping that story intact. So it really was just a lot of reflection on what we saw in the marketplace, what we saw from our project, and really where we saw things working and what clicked the most, and really focusing on those things.
So when you approach a new business, say, widget company down the street, and they take you on as a client and you do the initial interview and kind of like probing questions, what are you asking them? What are you trying to figure out that you can develop a game plan on and then kind of go from there? How does that first initial consult go?
Yeah, I mean, there's two big things that we want to know. The first is what's hot and important to you. So, what are the things that you're going to be bringing to market as an organization? And that, like I said, could be products and services. It could be campaigns and promotions. We've done work with companies where they say, listen, we do this quarterly promotion every year, and we just never seem to get the traction we want. We need somebody to help us activate it. It could be a branding or a merger situation, like a rebranding, like I talked about. So we want to know what are their key initiatives? What are the things that relate to their brand that they're bringing to market? The second is who talks to your customers? Anybody and everybody. Who is talking to your customers? I'll give you a great example. Probably the best example I have. We recently onboarded a new client. And they are the buyer, the prospect, was the CMO of a major pest control brand. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
And that brand had gone through not a complete rebranding, but a facelift. They had worked with their agency who actually introduced us to them. And they'd worked with an agency to reposition their brand story. And the brand story was resonating very well with customers. But as the CMO told us, if that story does not come through when my technician knocks on a door, I've got a problem. If that technician doesn't back up what my ads say, I've got a problem. And I give him credit. He's an enlightened CMO in this day and age.
To understand
to understand how important that is to his brand, but he gets it. And we look at it and say, who are all the people talking to your customers? And when we say all, we mean all. If they interface with a customer, they're a reflection of your brand. And we want to make sure that they understand what behaviors day in and day out are going to help them amplify your brand rather than detract from it. So what's hot and who are the people talking to your customers? Those are the first two things we're asking.
Okay.
Well, so it makes sense that, companies are obviously trying to, I guess they're becoming aware, or they're coming online that, consumer experience, customer experience is so important. And, as you mentioned, this particular CEO was a little bit progressive or a little ahead of the curve in that he understood this. But what is it that companies are struggling? Why are they struggling? Where are the break points where, in delivering this customer experience? I mean, is it something to do with the, top down lack of vision, or is it, bottom, something bad happens in the media and it's working its way back up and causing harm inside the company? Where are you seeing your biggest issues?
Yeah, I think that the simplest way I can think to answer it is when it comes to preparing people to represent the brand, it's a little bit different than just doing a product training, right? It's really understanding what role they play in delivering that company's, kind of core messages, core promises every single day. And we look at the methodologies that companies are using to kind of get that message out. And we actually did a research study with a customer insights and market research company called Focus Vision. We partnered with Focus Vision. We did a research study, and what we found was when we asked marketers, how are you spreading your key brand messages to the people at the front lines? And they said two things: product training and email. And we said, okay, so think about you as an employee. What is going to get your attention and motivate you to act in a different way? I wouldn't think that product training or email are going to be high on your list. So what we bring to the table is a new perspective on, if you want to get their attention and you want them to act differently, well, you need to do things differently. And if you deliver the most cost-effective communication you possibly can, being email, and you expect that that's going to get their attention, and it's going to be filled with an inbox filled with 100 other messages, you're mistaken. So what we bring the perspective of is, don't just double down on all the things you were always doing. If the email wasn't working, don't send more emails. If the training's not getting through, don't do more trainings. But the reaction by most organizations is, if the message isn't getting through, we're going to do more of the things that we were doing before. But that piling on can actually make the problem worse. What we do is we help them step back and reframe the problem and look at these audiences more as audiences to be marketed to, not groups to be trained. And in doing so, we help them get their message through in a much different way. So, it's a long way of basically saying they just double down on they just do more of what they were doing before. They see it as a volume problem, not a strategy problem. The strategy of reaching the audience is what needs to be relooked at.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a pretty smart approach. How do you then, I guess, as you're sitting down with your client and you're trying to determine, what's a home run, and you're trying to make this change, how do you measure the consistency of this brand story? So, I mean, some of the things you're talking about are pretty ethereal, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's all the way down to, the Chick-fil-A, telling everybody my pleasure working for you,
yep.
All the way down to the uniform or the way the way they're dressed or they carry themselves, all the way down to maybe the pen with the logo on it or whatever it is. But so there's a lot of different touch points. And so how do you measure, the overarching brand story to be sure that you are being consistent end to end? And then, one step further, how do you handle some of these ethereal things?
Yeah. So the simplest way to answer that is I referenced it before, but we have a measurement process. We have a measurement tool that we use, and it's called the brand transfer score. And this is one of the things we actually started developing this even before we launched InnerView. We said, if we're going to say the message is breaking down, and we know the message is breaking down, we have to be able to measure that breakdown in some way. And that's really where we think we're bringing something to the table that's very unique, especially for these large organizations, is a way to say and actually measure where the fallout is in the message. So we can come back to them and say, you as a corporate marketing team, you believe the story is this. We're going to take your version of the story as gospel. And then we ask the people in the field what their version of the story is. And we do a statistical analysis of how the field answers it compared to how the people at corporate answer it. So we're able to come back to them and give them, now we look at this as a leading indicator. This is taking something that's ethereal, like you said, and quantifying it a bit. But what we want to do is the end all be all is not saying your brand transfer score moved from X to Y. Okay. What we want to do is say, we are measuring the consistency and the alignment through the brand transfer score, but we're going to peg that brand transfer score to sales conversion. We're going to peg it to upsell and cross-sell rates. We're going to peg it to your NPS, your net promoter scores, your customer satisfaction, even all the way down to things like employee retention. We can peg the improvement in that score to a lot of other key metrics they're looking at day in and day out. We do not want to be having these ethereal conversations. We want to talk about hard metrics, but the way we get there is to have our compass, which is the brand transfer score, help guide us where we need to go.
So this to me sounds almost like a glorified game of telephone. You used to sit around and whisper into someone's ear and see what it comes out on the other end. But it almost sounds like you're doing this with their employees. Like, do you really get what they're saying and what they're trying to do? Is that just a simplified version of what you're doing, really?
So one of my measures of success when I have a conversation with somebody for the first time is, can I get them to say, "Oh, it sounds like a game of telephone"? If I can get them to say that, they understand. I was just writing it down right here for my new salesperson. But if you can get them to say the game of telephone, they've instantly, they as soon as they get to that point, they understand what it is that we do. So my response to you is, it's absolutely true. But if you are think about if you are the person who controls the purse strings on a major marketing budget, an advertising budget, and you cannot get the people who talk to your customers every day to even come close to representing the same story that you're paying your agency tens of millions of dollars to send out via various, media channels, that's a real problem. If you promise the customer one thing in an ad and they experience something different, we call that brand dilution. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what we studied. And marketers are telling us, we know we have brand dilution. We believe we have brand dilution, but we just don't know what to do about it. It's just something that it's always been there. But ultimately, that game of telephone, we had an article published today actually the headline was "The Costly Game of Telephone That Your Brand Is Playing." And that's exactly what you just described.
Nice.
So what do you guys do? And, not to go too far back, but you were talking earlier about the CEO who was pretty self-aware and realized, that this was a problem and recognized the importance in this. How do you go about customer acquisition? Like I imagine that these types of guys, these CEOs who really have an understanding, and maybe it's becoming more and more the norm, but there's got to be a generation of relic CEOs out there that maybe it's their ego or whatever, but they just don't seem to ascribe to these things, or they don't recognize the problem. How do you go out and find new business when you've got guys that maybe don't fully agree with your message?
Well, the simplest answer is we want to talk to the marketing department, because we look at it as, and not to correct you, but the person I was referencing before is actually the CMO. He's the chief marketing officer. And by the way, he's been there a long time. And this is not necessarily the most modern industry in the world,
sure.
But he's
taking
a smart
out yellow page ads.
Yeah, I mean, but and doing the the value packs that come in the mail and stuff that. But these are folks that are looking at their brand. That you're talking about a global brand, and they care about making sure their brand story is right. And I really think that when it comes to how do we go about acquisition, we don't think that people are necessarily Google searching for what we do every day. And we really believe we've reframed an opportunity to kind of reclaim some value for the marketing department. So we're always trying to get in front of the marketing department. From our end, we do heavy marketing from our end. For a company of our size, we're proud of what we do on the marketing side. And our job, our mission is to get this story in front of the marketers, because once they hear it, they're like, yes, I've sort of known that I've had this problem all along, but I've been relying on my training team, or I just kind of press my sales team, but I've never really taken control of it. So we're trying to put marketers in a spot where they look at this and say, you know what, if I took 10% of what I'm spending in advertising and shifted that over to really backing up my story at my front lines, my conversion and my cost to acquire are going to go way down. So we're trying to get it in front of the marketers. And when we do, we find that it resonates tremendously with the marketing staff.
Is there a business that's too small for you? Is there, like mom and pops that have 3 or 4 employees probably aren't your target market. Is there kind of like a cutoff that you kind of focus on?
The way we look at it is sort of on the lower end would be a company that's about $250 million in revenue. Okay. Now, could we help an organization that's $70 million and they're growing and they're adding Salesforce and things like that? Absolutely, we could. Where we're able, our number one goal is to prove ROI. We do guarantees in our deals. We'll do profit share or upside deals with our clients, because we want there to be some volume. We want it to be a situation where when we're talking to somebody and we say, what would 1% improvement look like, 2% improvement, that there's some scale there, that if we can deliver that, they're going to look at the money they spend on us and say, that's the best money I spent, because I spend $1 on them and they bring 15 or 20 back to me. So typically it has to be an organization that has some scale that's big enough we want there to be value for them. We don't want to just take their money to go in and be a bunch of consultants. We want to actually, provide value and drive ROI.
Well, and it's nice at that stage too, or sort of at that level, it's much easier to see an impact on ROI. If you can make a change in behavior, or some change along the way that will impact, their bottom line by even a percentage point or less, it's significant, versus like a mom and pop operation, like we brought up. That your big improvement for their 3 employees isn't going to be noticeable, or it's not going to move the needle that much. But when it
depends on the organization,
global powers,
It depends on the organization. The one of the smaller companies that we've worked with is still a good sized consumer brand, and we worked with 16 of their call center agents, and we worked with them for about a 10 or 12 week span, and really it was. All we did, we just sort of took their brand, their customer experience, and just we listened to them. We asked them what they thought their brand was, what was great about what they did, and we just baked the things that they already believed in into their process. And over a 6-month period, those 16 people drove a $14 million increase in revenue. Wow. And when I say increase, I mean if they had just stayed on their performance plane, and versus what they were doing, they added 14 million in incremental revenue. That's almost $1 million per employee. So their team doesn't have to be huge, but the opportunity to drive some revenue, typically we want that to be higher, but it depends on the channels. I mean, we look at technicians. We're talking to home services brands who send technicians into the home to do HVAC repair or to do washer, dryer, appliance repair. And the opportunity for them to make a better connection with the customer and drive revenue, you're talking about companies that have 2,000 technicians nationwide. You make a couple more sales, not only are you driving a better customer experience, but you're improving the company's bottom line.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I'd like to circle back a little bit to that idea of brand dilution that you brought up and just how big a problem that is. I think for people maybe outside of the marketing world, they don't understand that term or what it means. And, the major impact that can have, or the significant impact it can have, to a company and its bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is if you don't understand the concept, what I would ask you is, have you ever seen an advertisement for a price or an offer, and you either called a call center or you walked into a store and you said, I want this deal. And the person that you're talking to is like, oh, I'm not familiar with that offer. I haven't seen that yet. Well, let me go talk to my manager or see, like I haven't seen that price before. Anytime I'm sure it's happened to most people that you see an advertisement and you show up and you want that offer, you want that deal, and the person you're talking to doesn't know about that. That's a great example of the dilution that we're talking about. Yeah. The response from the customer is, this company does not have their act together. And we have a major client of ours who one of our stakeholders there said to us recently, we have to stop having our customers educating our people about our products and services.
That's bad.
So
That's
think
bad,
about that.
Actually.
Think about, but it's not uncommon at all. It's not uncommon at all that, think about auto brands. I mean, we could spend a whole show on
funny.
auto.
You said that, I was thinking of Kia, because your brother-in-law that bought the sports car, and Kia is not known for that. And then,
the Stinger, buy the Stinger.
Yeah.
But that's a great example. So Kia launches the Stinger. Okay. What do you do to make sure that the people in your auto dealership can convey that this South Korean manufacturer, who's known for reliability warranties and more of a family type vehicle, now is a viable a sports car company? How do you convince people of that? That's different. That's a little bit of a departure from their brand. And when we think about how this trickles down, if somebody walks in and says, I'm looking for a sports car, and the person in the dealership's like, you're at Kia. You're in the wrong place. Whoa. The red Stinger just rolled in off the truck. You got to be ready to be able to say, we're excited about the line of performance vehicles that we're launching. And let me take you over and show you the advancements that we've made. If they're not ready to make that pivot, that dilution happens. And those ads, and if you remember, do you remember how Kia launched the Stinger?
I haven't seen a single ad for it. I haven't even seen the car. He's talked about it. I'm like, oh, that's different.
Super Bowl ad. Yeah. Okay. It was a Super Bowl ad, and it was Steven Tyler. It was the lead singer of Aerosmith. And Dream On was playing. and he was in the car and he put it in reverse and he drove backward and he got younger. He was driving so fast that he got younger. He got out of the car and he was younger. And it was a younger version of Steven Tyler. That's how they launched it. Think about how much that costs. They, between the
just
agency that came
Steven
up with
Tyler
it,
on board,
just getting Steven Tyler, and then the airtime, and all, you're probably talking about that was probably a $15 to $20 million advertising effort just to get that one ad launched. So you think about that, and then you think about, okay, now we got to prepare 1,200 Kia dealerships nationwide or North America wide to be able to deliver on that message of we have performance vehicles. That's a great example. I'm not saying they did a good or a bad job. I'm just saying that creates such a huge potential for dilution if people are not lined up behind the message of Steven Tyler getting younger because he's driving so fast.
Yeah. No, I mean, I heard they put a bunch of hamsters out of work though because of Steven Tyler.
I was waiting for the hamsters.
So my wife, on the other hand, did buy a family Kia car because of the hamsters in the commercial.
Nice. That was the soul, I believe.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So okay. So we've talked about brand dilution, but let's talk about the flip side. Can you cite any examples that you've come across in your work, either clients that you've worked with or just companies you admire that are doing the right things, that are delivering on that brand promise? You mentioned Nike earlier. I think they do a pretty decent job of that. But can you cite some examples that would be, brands people would know?
Let's stick with auto for a minute. How about Subaru? Okay, local. The U.S. headquarters are in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, right across the river from where I sit. And I was at an amusement park this past weekend, and they have like a water park. And later in the season, right before they drain the pools for the winter, they do a doggy swim, and it's all sponsored by Subaru. Okay,
it sounds
Subaru's
just like what they would do.
It does, but they walk the walk.
Brand, right? That's the point.
They walk the walk, and but this is the thing. Not only do they walk the walk in terms of what they do from a brand activation standpoint, they activate it with their employees as well. The people who represent that brand believe in Subaru. They believe in love. That's what makes a Subaru. And really helping people embrace that brand story and that brand message. And it's authentic when they're standing. I started talking to the representative at the booth. They had a brand new Outback out there. I was taking a look at the car. And I admire the way that I would literally say Subaru is one of the very few companies I would say they don't need our help because I think they do such an excellent job. Some of the other more classic ones that I'd say, you mentioned Chick-fil-A does an excellent job of making, buying fried chicken and French fries, and, an experience, a worthwhile experience. Southwest, I unfortunately don't have a lot of Southwest flights here out of Philadelphia, but I fly Southwest whenever I can just because I feel like that message of who they are is baked into every aspect of the customer experience, and they are on brand. They are on message every single time. From the jokes on the flights to the people who man the counters to the baggage handlers, they're on brand.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess Subaru's, though, they've got somebody coming now. They've got Hyundai is coming out with hope. So their cars have got hope now. So Subaru's going to have to keep their eyes peeled. They got Hyundai on their backside.
They're going to be hard to cut into that messaging. I mean, they've carved out such a great space for themselves. I admire them a lot.
Yeah, really cool brand, really cool company. And honestly, I love that Outback. That's a sweet car.
It is a sweet car.
So, hey, we have a lot of, growing business owners, people who are just getting started that listen to this show. Do you have any sort of tips or ideas, things like that have come along your way that as they're developing these budding brands and things like that they could start applying to sort of set some of these things into action early on?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, there are two things that immediately come to mind. The first is really put the time in on your messaging. There's a product for everything. And unless you've completely reinvented the mousetrap, there's a reasonable alternative for almost every product. You think about people that are developing apps. There's a lot of apps that do really great, amazing things. But man, the barrier to entry there is so low. Somebody can duplicate that so quick. You've got to have a message. You've got to have a value proposition that's really airtight. You need to understand, really what problem it is you're solving, what value you're offering to the customer, and really get people rallied around that. So spending the time to really think about what your message and your value proposition are, that's where I see the difference between success and maybe not as much success for young business owners. Is really around being able to articulate what value you bring. So spending time, whether you're big or small, you have to articulate your value very clearly. So I would say that's number one.
How would you go about starting that? I mean, like what are some actionable items that someone could do once they kind of have an idea of what their story is, what their brand is? How do they get that in front of the customer in a actionable way and start developing that brand? You're
actually, that sort of ties in with my second, my second key action that I'd recommend is get input from a lot of people. And I look at it as if you don't have a lot of employees, then friends, family, people in your networks, getting out and talking. There's no substitute for getting out and just talking and hearing people react to your story and gathering the input. There's going to be some feedback that you get that infuriates you because they don't get it and their feedback stinks and you're going to be frustrated. But it doesn't mean that their feedback didn't get you one step closer to really tightening your message up to a point where, people really are going to get it. So, I really believe in, I'm practicing what I preach, which is organizations need to be tapping into their people. If they're a big organization, ask your people what they think, involve them in the process. You never know where a great nugget of wisdom is going to come from. So tapping into that expertise that comes from within is so huge for big companies. But even for a smaller organization, think about all your stakeholders. Be talking to your partner, your spouse. Be talking to your brothers and sisters. Former colleagues. Get your own little focus groups together. Talk to a lot of people. Get their reaction. And frankly, the more relevant the audience, the better. So if you are targeting a new industry that maybe the people in your network don't know as well, go out to a networking group and offer to sponsor a happy hour and get their feedback. The more input you can get, the more things you hear coming back, the more it's going to help you hone your message. And again, that doesn't matter if you're Subaru and you're gathering input. I'm sure they're gathering feedback from their employees all the time about how to improve the customer experience and how to show love to their customers. And you don't have to be big. If you're a small organization, you could be gathering a lot of input every single day. Yeah. Get a free SurveyMonkey account.
That actually sounds like a really kind of like an approach towards the lean startup method. I have a friend that's really heavily into that, and he's been working on some projects with that. But as he's kind of describing it to me, it sounds like it's very similar because you want to ask your customers, like, okay, how was your experience? How was this? How was that? And by defining those key things, you're essentially you're taking a lot of the trial and error out of the equation, and you're able to move on to the next step without going through the headache of messing up and doing that just by asking a few follow-up questions to your clients. Or
I was just going to say, I think you're absolutely right, but I think what it will do is it's not going to take all the guesswork out of it. At some point, you're going to have the information in front of you and you're going to have to decide. Yeah. And I would say if I was going to add a third or, item 2.5, it would be once you feel like you've gathered a lot of information, you feel like your story's coming together, at some point you have to decide and you've got to get on that horse and you've got to ride it, right? The story can't always be in flux. At some point you have to say, okay, what I have right now is good enough for now. And you've got to get out there and you've got to tell that story and you've got to let it evolve over time. But the core of your messaging can't constantly be in flux. Get yourself to the point where you really feel like you've got that core value proposition down. And then some of the positioning and the way you target certain audience, there's going to be nuance over time. And I'm not saying go blindly, against the evidence that you see, but gather enough evidence where you feel like you've got something that's worth betting on. But especially for entrepreneurs, you've got to, at some point, you're making your bet. You're never going to have so much information that it's a slam dunk. At some point, you're going to have to say, I've got enough info. I'm betting on this message. I'm betting on this value prop. And you've got to sell it like your life depended on it.
I like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Just sort of in a related topic, this idea of small businesses that are just kind of getting going and trying to avoid pitfalls. Can you point out, or is there a clear line where the gap between the branding and the employees starts to appear? Like, is there, maybe it's a game of scale or something after you have X number of employees, there's an issue that starts to happen? Or like, is there some sort of clear line where you feel like you have it all, but then things start to spin out of control?
Really astute question. No, listen, I think there are. So I can tell you from experience, the firm that we were a part of out of Chicago, that organization did work with some more startups, with some younger and smaller organizations. They worked with a lot of private equity funds, and worked with a bunch of their portfolio companies. And I'm going to tell you that the element of scale that is going to drive the most complexity and the most challenge is going to be the addition of frontline leaders. Mm-hmm. So when you start to add frontline leaders, so let's say you're an organization that has a sales department, and it's basically your head of sales is overseeing 4 or 5 salespeople. Well, that next wave of salespeople that you hire, or customer service reps, whatever it is, as soon as you go from, okay, the core team is sort of managing the message there, and then you have to insert a layer of management in between. Maybe you hire another 5 or 10 people, and you hire somebody to manage those folks. As soon as you start to have that layer of frontline management in there, that becomes the pivot. In every organization we've ever worked with, the leverage point for the message, the brand, the story, is that frontline manager. So as you start adding 1, 2, 3 frontline managers, that's where we really have to look at it and say, we've got to keep that audience dialed in. We've got to keep them on message, because they're the people that we need to amplify our story day in and day out. When we do our brand transfer studies and we get that score back, we look at what the frontline, we have people segment, in terms of frontline managers. And we look very closely at that data to find out, is your message breaking down at the frontline leadership level? So I would say that's like one of those benchmarks to look for, is when you start adding that sales manager, that customer service manager, and it's somebody from outside the organization, that's when you start to get that dilution problem.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Let's switch gears just a little bit. I want to maybe clarify, I work in advertising and marketing too, so a lot of what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but I want to maybe break down a couple things for people who aren't necessarily in that industry. And one of the things that I kind of wanted to talk about is this idea of customer experience and what that even really means. I think a lot of us understand the basic premise, right? Whatever our expectation is has been set by an ad or whatever is what that experience looks like. But can you talk about some of the different touch points and the ways that companies are developing meaningful brand experiences?
Yeah, and that's a major topic. And I would say that when we thought about starting InnerView, it all comes back to the trend toward customer experience. And I think that, the phrase we use, or the phrase that we picked up on in the study that we did, is this idea of the experience economy. And for your listeners who don't necessarily know the marketing, advertising, and customer experience world, what I would say is customer experience can be summed up by saying, at the end of the day, organizations have to put themselves in a spot where people are willing to choose them for only the experience that they deliver. Because there's so much product and price parity across most categories that organizations have to really take a sober look at their organization and say, will people pay more to do business with us just because of how easy it is to do business with us, or how pleasurable it is to do business with us? So some of those that really is the touch points become the companies who can remove friction. Okay, it's, does a person answer the call and can help me immediately, or do I get bounced around in IVR for a voice response system for 15 minutes? When I go into the store, do they have something there in stock for me, or can have it to me the next day? Or is there a runaround about there being stock issues? There's a lot that goes into, and have you ever seen a customer journey map? It's anything from learning about the ad or seeing an ad digitally, going through the website, and the whole journey that the customer takes, all these different nodes that they touch the company through. And there's a real science behind it. The aspect of it that we really focus on is when there's human-to-human contact, how are the organizations, A, reducing friction, and B, making sure that interaction reflects their brand each and every time. I'll give you an example. I think Nordstrom's a great example, okay? They're another one of those classic, they're classically recognized for their customer experience. But when we do sessions with companies, we say, okay, who's ever shopped at a Nordstrom? They raise their hand. And then I say, okay, who's ever walked into a Nordstrom and spent less money than they anticipated? And no hands go up. No hands go up. You never spend less money in a Nordstrom than when you walked in. And I said, who's ever left a Nordstrom unhappy? Okay, no hands go up. So you walked in with an expectation of what you were going to spend. You spent, or maybe it was none, but you spent more than you expected, and you were happier to spend it. That's customer experience. They put you in a spot where they delivered an overall experience from the way it was merchandised to the way your interactions went with the humans in the store, that you were willing to pay more than you expected and happy to pay more than you expected, because they built in enough positivity in that experience where now it's worth doing business with them versus going to Macy's or whomever their competitive set is. So they're a great example of people that have built value into that new way of thinking, which is, would a customer choose us just for our experience alone, or pay more for us just because of our experience alone?
Cool. I think that's awesome. I think that's a really good place to wrap this up. Let's talk, how do people get in touch with you? How do they engage with InnerView or with yourself personally? If one of our listeners or somebody they know had some interest in this space and was trying to improve their business, how would they get in touch?
Yeah, we'd love to connect with whomever wants to reach out. Easiest ways through our website, it's InnerViewGroup.com. I want to be clear, it's INNER. We are helping marketers take an inner view, look at their organization, not just always the outside view. So it's InnerView, INNER, viewgroup.com. So that's the easiest way. Myself, I'm on LinkedIn. Christopher Wallace is a common name. So I'm in Philadelphia. So if you're looking and want to try to find me on LinkedIn, happy to connect. You can reach out to me there. And my email directly is cwallace, WALLACE, @InnerViewGroup.com.
Yeah, I was just going to compliment you on your name, because InnerView is kind of it's a play on the words, but it's really direct and to the point of what you're trying to accomplish as a business. So compliments on that.
Thank you. Well, again, we spent some time on it. So we felt like it tied in with our message. I thought you were going to compliment my actual name. Most people bring up that I have the same name as the notorious B.I.G., Christopher Wallace. So, so I do have a common name. So again, Philadelphia is where I'm located.
Well, I know that there's some politician, jockeying with you for Google placement. So,
I'm
that
sure
was
there is.
when we were doing initial research, we were having trouble not finding that guy.
Okay.
So anyway.
So I'm not a politician.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much, Chris. We really appreciate your time. We will send everybody, once again, that is just InnerViewGroup.com, INNERViewGroup.com. And thanks so much for your time, man. Really appreciate you making the time to visit with us.
Guys, I really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for having me on.
Not a problem. Take care.
Take care.
Bye, guys.